Hi, this is the Broadway Almanac. I'm George Hardy, your host. Today I am going to tell you about Porgy and Bess, the classic opera from 1935. Or is it a musical? Well, more about that later. Throughout the 1920s, George Gershwin, along with most of the other white Jewish composers in New York, went up to Harlem, to the clubs, to hear the black jazzers, the Cotton Club, the Savoy Ballroom. They went up there to hear Fats Waller, Ethel Waters, Cab Calloway, Chick Webb, and all the rest. Gershwin especially mixed the toe-tapping rhythms that he heard in Harlem with the minor mode chords of his Jewish heritage, an amalgam that he used to create so many classics of the early American songbook. Fascinating Rhythm, Nice Work If You Can Get It, Embraceable You, I Got Rhythm. So, did George and Ira Gershwin appropriate African American culture and music? Well, I'm afraid so. But at least George Gershwin, more than any of the other white composers of those early days, was fully aware of what he was gaining from the Harlem Renaissance. For example, in 1925, George Gershwin sent W.C. Handy a copy of the score for Rhapsody in Blue and wrote on it, "To Mr. Handy, whose early blues songs are the forefathers of this work. With admiration and best wishes, signed George Gershwin." By 1932, George and his brother Ira were at the top of their game. Pop hits from their musical theater scores, sheet music sales, records, radio airplay. George even had his own nationally syndicated radio show several nights a week on NBC. And George was the first Tin Pan Alley composer to cross over into the concert hall. Rhapsody in Blue in 1924, later in the decade, his Concerto in F, and of course, An American in Paris. So in 1932, when Otto Kahn of the Metropolitan Opera Company approached the Gershwin brothers about writing an opera, why, George Gershwin felt they were ready. For years, George Gershwin hinted in interviews his desire to create a full-scale work based on the music of the American Negro, and now, here was his chance. The novel Porgy by DuBose Heyward was first published in 1925. Heyward learned about the Gullah culture when he worked in a cotton warehouse in Charleston, South Carolina. By the way, the Gullah Geechee people are descendants of Africans who were enslaved on the Sea Island cotton and rice plantations of the lower Atlantic coast, primarily North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. The nature of their enslavement on these isolated island and coastal plantations brought about a unique culture with deep African roots. They even developed their own language. You know what the most well-known Gullah word is today? Kumbaya, which means come by here, a phrase of welcome. Porgy became a hot property. Movie rights were sold, a stage version became successful on Broadway. Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein of Showboat fame were interested in a musical theater version. And so was the most popular entertainer of the times, Al Jolson, who wanted to produce Porgy himself and play the role in blackface. That wasn't going to happen. But the Gershwin brothers' track record won out. So DuBose Heyward went with the brothers and the Metropolitan Opera deal. But the Gershwins insisted that only black actors and singers be used in their production. In fact, the Gershwin estate still to this day maintains that mandate. But the Metropolitan Opera was still run by the remnants of the untitled aristocracy of the Gilded Age, and said the show would be staged with white actors in blackface. And besides, they said there's not enough black opera singers around anyway. But the Gershwin brothers would not back down. They pulled out of the contract with the Met and put their own money into their own show and opened Porgy and Bess in a Broadway theater. What happened to the Metropolitan Opera deal? The Met did not stage Porgy and Bess until 1985. Although the reviews after opening night in 1934 weren't all that great, frankly. Porgy and Bess had a slow rise to classic status and greatness over the decades. The critics, while they acknowledged the brilliant music, complained that the show was neither fish nor fowl. One minute it seemed like an opera, the next a Broadway entertainment. And what is an opera doing in a Broadway theater anyway? George Gershwin was asked about this. Is it a musical theater piece or is it an opera? And in the New York Times, George Gershwin wrote an article that said that Porgy and Bess is a folk opera. Asked what that is, he said that the characters in the piece would have certainly sung folk songs and spirituals. And I could have used some. There's plenty around. But an opera should sound all of one piece, cut from the same cloth, so to speak. So I wrote my own folk songs and spirituals. Therefore, Porgy and Bess is a folk opera. Decades later, in reviewing the 1959 film with Sidney Poitier, James Baldwin said that while he liked and admired Porgy and Bess very much, it remains a white man's vision of Negro life. But over the years, Porgy and Bess has given much work and voice to African American opera singers at a time when leading stages still barred black talent. For example, Leontine Price played Bess in a production right out of Juilliard. Of course, most of you know that George Gershwin died at the age of 38 in July of 1937, 5 hours after a surgery to remove a brain tumor. His brother Ira, who lived until 1983, felt that George would have certainly worked to improve and update Porgy and Bess had he lived. But as a result, other forces tried to do it instead. There's versions leaving out the operatic recitatives, others adding material to clarify, others to soften racial stereotypes, others to make it more like a musical theater piece. As a result, today there is no definitive version of Porgy and Bess. As a result, there are very few regional productions of the show mounted these days. But the Tony Award-winning adaptation from 2011 by playwright Suzanne Laurie Parks and Deidre Murray, with additional scenes and updated musical arrangements, is the current model for this classic and groundbreaking work. That's your Broadway Almanac. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm George Harder. So long, until next time.